The elation Darth Vader felt in having finally defeated his former master Obi-Wan Kenobi and avenged the events of Mustafar was quickly erased by the confusing and somewhat horrifying reality that Obi-Wan had completely disappeared. As we'll see, Vader's reaction to Obi-Wan disappearing was unique for the Sith Lord and had a profound effect on him. But the rare feat of suddenly disappearing out of nowhere, combined with Vader's astonishment and shock, always caused me to question, did Vader actually tell his master Darth Sidious about Obi-Wan disappearing after their duel? At first, you'd think that Vader would have told Sidious of how the duel ended, there being no way that he could just let such an event pass without trying to determine exactly what happened, thereby turning to the vast knowledge and wisdom of Sidious. But as we'll see, looking at both perspectives of the Master and Apprentice, I think we can argue that within the Legends lore, Vader never did tell Sidious about Obi-Wan disappearing in Episode 4. Let's start by looking at Vader's perspective, and why he wouldn't reveal the details of the duel's end to his Master. Given Vader's reaction to Obi-Wan's disappearance, it appears that this would be something he had to tell Sidious. He was terrified upon finding that Obi-Wan had completely vanished. As he looked down to see only his former master's robes and cloak, Vader thought it was an impossibility, an illusion or Jedi mind trick of some kind that Obi-Wan deployed as a tactic for the duel. But as Vader came to terms with the fact that Obi-Wan was simply gone, he was afraid, terrified, despite being one of the two most powerful individuals within the galaxy. Because Vader had such a strong reaction, we'd think he'd bring up how the duel ended with Obi-Wan to Sidious the first chance he had. And as the Death Star novel reveals, in a way, that was Vader's intention, but only specific details about the events. Given that the Jedi themselves had only recently discovered the ability to becoming a Force ghost, it's not surprising that Vader didn't know such a power existed. The novel explains that Vader had never seen or heard of Jedi simply vanishing into nothingness, nor had he ever heard of this power from Sidious. Vader was certain that if it truly was a power gained through the Force, it had to exist within the dark side, potentially connected to the discoveries uncovered by Sidious's own master, Darth Plagueis, who Vader knew was obsessed with preserving his immaterial ego after his physical death and the destruction of his body. Importantly, Death Star explains that Vader was determined to ask Sidious about the potential for this ability. But the novel is clear it wasn't Vader's intention to tell Sidious about the ability having any connection to Obi-Wan or the end of their duel on the Death Star. Vader merely wanted potential insight on Jedi vanishing as a power that existed through the dark side. And the novel explains why it wasn't likely that Vader would ever reveal that Obi-Wan disappeared, despite his curiosity with Jedi knowing how to vanish into nothingness. The initial fear that Vader had regarding Obi-Wan's disappearance completely vanished even before the events that would lead to the destruction of the Death Star. After the duel, still within the events of Episode 4, Vader thought deeply on the matter for a long time and came to a firm conclusion. Regardless of what happened to his body, Obi-Wan was dead, gone from the galaxy, with his physical form and influence never to be seen again. That was what Vader knew, and that was what was important to him. This conclusion found within the Death Star novel is crucial to our question here. It shows that Vader only considered Obi-Wan's disappearance following their duel as a physical matter, which is to say, he never stopped to question whether Obi-Wan's consciousness had been retained or could manifest itself again within the physical galaxy. And that just makes perfect sense, as Vader had no understanding of Jedi becoming Force ghosts or that one's consciousness could even be retained after death. Obi-Wan's disappearance was completely incidental to the more important result of his former master's death. Therefore, this is how Vader likely framed it to Sidious, that Obi-Wan had simply died. And of course, the disappearance of his body wouldn't be completely forgotten given the curiosity that surrounded it. But Vader was only interested in that aspect as a power that he might be able to utilize in some way, and certainly not connected to the fact that Obi-Wan's consciousness was retained. Since we know the importance of Obi-Wan's disappearance in that moment, we'd assume Vader would bring it up to Sidious the first chance he had. But Vader had no idea, and really, he didn't even care that much within the aftermath of the duel, concerned primarily with the fact that he finally avenged himself for the events of Mustafar and finally defeated Obi-Wan. As Vader would say in Episode 4, it would be a day long remembered, for it had seen the end of Obi-Wan, carried forward into Episode 5, as he explained to Sidious that Obi-Wan couldn't help Luke anymore. For Vader, the ending to his duel with the Jedi Master was important for one reason. Obi-Wan was dead, and the physical aspects of his disappearance were incidental, something that might be discussed with Sidious as a general Jedi quality, and even then, only once the rebellion was defeated, showing no urgency on the part of Vader to reveal Obi-Wan's disappearance to his master. I believe this is also borne out in Sidious's knowledge and actions within the Star Wars Legends lore. Sidious's perspective in this question is actually much more interesting in my opinion, as there were aspects that Sidious understood that Vader had no knowledge of. But again, I believe this knowledge points to the fact that Vader never told him about Obi-Wan's disappearance following their duel on the Death Star. Like all Sith apprentices within the Rule of Two era, Sidious benefited tremendously from the knowledge of his master Darth Plagueis. As depicted in his writings within the Book of Sith, unlike Vader, Plagueis did have a degree of understanding that Jedi could become Force ghosts, as well as some of the characteristics that accompanied this phenomenon. In a section entitled Transcending Death, Plagueis wrote that during the Great Sith Wars, which occurred roughly 4,000 years before the era of the films, it was understood that some Jedi vanished at the moment of their deaths, with their bodies being converted into energy. Plagueis continued by explaining that it wasn't merely that the Jedi vanished, but they also returned as pure consciousness, able to fully communicate information to those who still existed within the physical world. In other words, they would become Force ghosts, which is exactly what Plagueis referred to them as. Plagueis even references how the lore keepers of the wills work to maintain one's visual and auditory awareness and consciousness after physical death, the origins of how Qui-Gon was able to discover the secret within Star Wars Legends, learning it from the wills. The greatest part of all this is we don't have to assume that Sidious learned this important knowledge regarding the potential for Force ghosts to exist. We know that he knew this. Not only did Sidious include these lessons within his Book of Sith, but on the exact same pages where Plagueis wrote about these qualities, Sidious made his own notes, discussing his own knowledge and abilities in the realm of transcending death. And it wasn't that Sidious and Plagueis rejected these Jedi stories outright either. Because they didn't have evidence to dismiss the possibilities, they couldn't reject the idea of Force ghosts entirely. But they had their own preferred methods to achieve immortality, Plagueis through midichlorian manipulation, and Sidious through essence transfer and the use of clones, which for the Sith would be far more valuable than simply retaining one's consciousness. The important point for our current question is this. By the time of Episode 4, Darth Sidious knew the following. It was possible for Jedi to vanish at the moment of their death. When this happened, it was connected to the return of these Jedi as pure consciousness, retaining their awareness and essence of their former living selves. In this form, they could communicate with the living, providing specific and verifiable instructions. And finally, this ability originated with the wills. In other words, Sidious completely understood the elements for Jedi becoming Force ghosts. And this is why I believe Vader never told his master about Obi-Wan disappearing. If Vader mentioned that Obi-Wan vanished, it would have been the catalyst for Sidious to understand the full sequence of events just described. Based upon the knowledge he had through Plagueis, he had to have known that Obi-Wan discovered the secret to becoming a Force ghost, doing what the Jedi did during the Great Sith Wars. The interpretations of Obi-Wan's disappearance would be completely different. While Vader saw it simply as a physical phenomenon unconnected to retaining one's consciousness, Sidious would know otherwise, with the Jedi's vanishing upon their death indicating the beginning of their journey to continuing to communicate with the physical living world. And yet, as I understand it, Sidious never indicated he believed this of Obi-Wan, or worked to confront him as a Force ghost. In fact, in the Episode 6 novelization, Sidious seems genuine in his belief, as Vader was, that Obi-Wan was dead. Sidious taunted Luke with this fact, telling the Jedi that Vader saw to it that Obi-Wan had been killed, and then furthered his own understanding of Luke's training by determining simply that Yoda began training him after Obi-Wan's defeat at the hands of Vader. Therefore, based upon the Legends lore, Vader never told his master about Obi-Wan's disappearance following their duel in Episode 4. For Vader, it just wasn't important, not understanding the significance of it and focusing more on the fact that he finally achieved his revenge by killing his former master, while Sidious gave no indication he suspected Obi-Wan had become a Force ghost, something that he likely would have understood if Vader simply informed him of the full details regarding the duel's end. So there we have it, whether Vader told Sidious about Obi-Wan disappearing after their duel in Episode 4. Thank you very much to all of the Patreon members of Star Wars Reading Club, as your support is so greatly appreciated. You can find all of our social media links and a link to our Star Wars gaming channel in the description below for updates and even more Star Wars content. We love making these videos, so why not subscribe for more fun Star Wars theories and discussions. Also, if you enjoyed the video, think about giving a like or leaving a comment. If not for me, for having bigger concerns.